It is, well, it began as an Orthodox, I think it's Russian Orthodox, which is kind of interesting.
Really?
Yeah, because the Saint Catherine's, the Codex Sinaiticus, this book was sold to the Tsar, and the Tsar and its had his, and this would have been the end of the 19th century. The Tsar had his army there protecting the monastery, and in exchange for that protection, he was given the Codex Sinaiticus that I talked about last time. But it is right at the foot of Mount Sinai, and then the reason it's so important, as I mentioned before, is that this Codex Sinaiticus, this text written most likely on vellum, if probably not papyrus, it probably wouldn't have lasted that long. But it comes from the 4th century, and it is probably the oldest and most complete Bible that we have. It even includes texts that are not in our current Bible, like the letter of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermes. But the reason I wanted to show, darn, where am I going here, Dan? The reason I wanted to show this is because this is where, for all intents and purposes, the experiential beginning of Judaism lies. It is the experience of Moses and the experience of a slave people that are on the run from Egypt, from a pharaoh there, most likely Ramses II, where something experiential, something existential happens to them, and they see themselves as the bearers of a covenant of a God that is reputed to be the God of their ancestors. Now, most likely, I hate to say this because it upsets so many people, but most likely the experience came first, and then reflection on stories that had, brought them up to that point were developed. So many people will put the Sinai experience of Moses, the burning bush, as the point in time and space where the Israelite covenant really begins. And then, of course, the stories about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob come after that. But the experience itself is one that is very unique in that, remember what the context is. This is the ancient Near East, where most human beings are just meddlesome, of no interest to the gods themselves, and they basically have to appease the gods in all that they do. But here we have quite the opposite. We have a god at that time. In 1250 BCE, when this took place, there wasn't a sense that this was the only God. This is going to develop over time. We know this because God says, "You shall have no other gods before me." And he literally means don't worship Baal or Asherah or these other gods. But this God comes to the people, right? And says to them, "I want you to represent my will on earth." And Moses, of course, says, "Well, who should I say, sent me when I go to the slaves in Egypt? And I want to know your name," which is extraordinary in and of itself, because in the Middle East, in the ancient Near East, to know someone's name is to have some sort of intimate relationship with that person. To give someone your name is to give them something of your identity. And God says, my name is Yod He Vav He, Yahweh, as we say, and it's often translated in the Bible as I am. I am. It really is more of a verb, as a great Jewish theologian who died at the end of who wrote at the end of the 19th century, Martin Buber, said the real name should be something along the lines of, "I will be whatever I will be. I am the source of all that is, really. I am the breath that enlivens all things." to try to name me, when we name things, we stand apart from it, make of it an object that we can identify, right? Well, if God is the source of all naming, if God is the source of all being, where can we stand apart from that and make of God an object, and say, oh, there's that object God over there. So this is what's implied in that, don't try to name me, because I'll tell you what, it's like running away from your feet. Yeah. Your feet are the precondition for running, and you cannot run away from them. Well, naming God, the ability that you have to name God begins with God. So you cannot ever objectify that. So don't do it, because as soon as you do, it turns into an idol. And that is the first commandment, right? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the house of Egypt, out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me, and you should not make any graven images of me or any other gods, right? So this is why I like to introduce here, as I did last time, the idea that is a Kabbalistic idea. The Kabbalah was a Jewish mystical tradition that arose in the Middle Ages, but Kabbalists say that this, goes all the way back to the time of Moses, and they interpret Moses and the law of Moses in a very mystical fashion. But they argue that God, for all intents and purposes, is a verb. God is not, even to suggest that God is a noun creates, an objective nature to God. So for this reason, Jews will not ever mention the name of God. They will say Adonai, which means Lord, or simply Hashem, which means the name. Very interesting perspective there. So that's where we were last time. Are there any ideas or thoughts
Danny?
this brings up? Go ahead, Denny.
Yeah, John Dominic Crossan references this on page 54, the place where he studied. Uh, and it's really kind of neat to think of him in that St. Catherine's Monastery, um, page 54.
Yeah. Oh, the Greek Orthodox. Yeah. Okay. Well, I wonder why the Russians. You're absolutely right. It is Greek Orthodox.
Oh, Dan,
Yeah.
was there a Rus in the 6th century? Or, I mean, just roaming tribes in what is now present-day Russia?
In the
Uh,
six, I don't think, I really don't know my history well enough to know, but
it's
why do
pretty
you,
scarce.
can
I
I
think
ask
it's pretty
why?
scarce.
Well, at that time, the Orthodox Church was the standard church. They didn't call themselves Orthodox until much, much later. And then, of course, there was Coptic Orthodox and Russian and Greek Orthodox. Very interesting, very interesting theology that's very incarnational too. But thank you for pointing that out. I just assumed from the history of the Codex Sinaiticus that there was some sort of Russian connection there. Um, any other questions or comments? Thank you. Well, let's move on then, as Crossan does, and talk about the content of the name. A name represents an identity as well as a character of a person or a reputation. And Crossan goes, interestingly enough, to a place that is very important for Jews, but that to our disadvantage, I think, to our detriment, we have tended to overlook. And that is the codes of laws and regulations that we find in Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus, uh, especially in the Reform tradition, where we tend to think of, following law as, a works righteousness that completely undermines God's grace. We don't spend a lot of time, unfortunately, thinking about the profound nature of those early books and what these people were trying to do. They were trying to reflect in their own sense of identity, the holiness of God. Of course, they had the 10 Commandments, but of course, over time, especially all the way up, let's say, Moses brings the people out of Egypt around 1200. Some seminal form of the covenant develops then, but all the way up until the 5th century, the 6th and 5th century BCE, you have people developing a sense of what it means to be in covenant with God. You have a sense among the judges. You have a Davidic sense of what it means to be a covenant with God. God choosing David and David's lineage as his special king. You also have, after the Babylonian captivity, when there is no monarchy anymore, another sense of what it means to be in covenant with God. And this is where the book of Leviticus is written. Uh, Even though the book of Leviticus, if you've ever read it, it's a lot of don't do this, don't do this, don't, all of this. And some of it's very, very granular in its focus on what it is you can and cannot do. But it's helpful for us to know just how this book was written. And because I think Crossan assumes some of this on the part of his readers. And I think it might be time for a nice, a nice review of where Leviticus comes from. This, by the way, is where we are in that Sunday school class that I'm currently teaching as well. But you might remember that in 587 BCE, right after King Josiah tried to establish a kind of holiness code and a means for acting nobly and in a sacred manner in Jerusalem, Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. And the priests that were associated with the temple were taken away, as well as the aristocratic class, as well as the artisan class. And by 587 BCE, the temple was destroyed. And you had a group of people known as Israelites at the time, the covenant people living in Babylon on the banks of the Kebar River. And this is where we get Psalm 137, by the waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept. And lest they become assimilated into Babylonian culture, the priests got to work saying, we obviously were not following God's law as we should have before. So what we need to do is really make it crystal clear what it is that is required of us to be God's covenant people. And the Levitical priests, this is why we have the term Leviticus, sit down over time and begin to develop a law code. And it comes to be known as the Holiness Code. And it's introduced in Leviticus 19, verse 2. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Hallow my name, or speak to all the congregation. This is, God speaking to either Moses or Aaron. Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel and tell them, you shall be holy, for I, Yahweh, your God, am holy. Well, then the natural response is, it begs the question, well, how are we supposed to be holy? And to what end are we supposed to be holy? And this is where the real intellectual work of trying to understand what God's purpose is in creating a covenant. Obviously, and this is relevant to our class on Sunday, obviously, it's not to be a kind of an empire that Josiah and King David and other kings before them, or other kings before Josiah, all the way back to David. It's not to be a great empire, a political dynasty like, all of the others. It's not to be a Babylon. It's not to be an Assyria. It's not to be an Egypt. That just happens to be a trail, a kind of a rabbit path that takes you away from the real direction that God wants you to go. But the identity of a covenant people is a moral identity. It's not a national identity. And in order for you to know what that moral identity is, we are going to lay it out for you. And the Levitical priests, and this is, this is unfortunate, but there are two directions. There are ways that you can worship God that are holy, and there are ways that you can interact with your neighbor that are holy. So the covenant code focuses on both of those things: how to approach the temple, how to approach worship of God. Now, remember, the priests still believe that they're going to go back, or that they should worship God in some form that involves sacrifice. Eventually, people are going to question that. Do we really need the whole sacrifice thing? It seems like God wants us to be holy with respect to our moral responsibilities to others. And it's going to create a division within Judaism, as it comes to be called in Babylon. There will be some who say, no, there must be a temple where we worship, and others will say, I don't think so. I think following the law is what's the most important. And any sacrifice is really sacrificing our will on the sacred altar of the Torah, of Scripture. And we still have this conversation today between liberal Jews and conservative Jews. It's the conservative Jews who are currently who currently have the ear of Benjamin Netanyahu, and the mouth, we might say, of Benjamin Netanyahu in present day Israel. So it's Crossan's understanding that this Levitical code is a moral code that is going to tell the people how to hallow the name of God. If God's name is hallowed and it is sacred, and we are in partnership with God, then the logical conclusion is that we must also be hallowed as well. And Crossan makes the point, a very good point. Remember in chapter 1 how we were talking about the tendency to pray to God either in terms of prayers of supplication, oh God, please give us this, or thanksgiving on the one hand, but also to pursue justice. And this is the way the prophets want us to pray. And unfortunately, the Psalms suggest one way of doing it, and the prophets suggest the other. But Crossan wants to bring these two together and say, in Leviticus, we see a synthesis, we might say, a complementarity of ritual acts and justice. We see ritual and justice going hand in hand. The pursuit of distributive justice must be ritualized, and the rituals of worship in the congregation must attend to distributive justice, as a second act. So remember how the Lord's Prayer has those two parts to it that are, in complementarity. So ritual and justice are in complementarity to each other. It's not enough just to go to church on Sunday, if you want to put that way. It's not enough just to sacrifice to God, but that sacrifice must demonstrate the holy name of God, which is made manifest in distributive justice. And divine holiness itself empowers the people to do that justice, to pursue that justice. So their call is very, very clear in the Levitical code. As God delivers, as God is a liberator, we saw that in Egypt, so must the people of God be liberators. So must the people of God be deliverers. And so this is where the whole pursuit of justice is seen as having been empowered by God. And I just want to read this quote on page 59 and 60, if I can. We are never allowed to forget divine holiness as a model, or better, as empowerment. Divine holiness as an empowerment for human holiness. But notice especially that climactic identification of God as the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt. God is the deliverer, the Redeemer and Savior of the oppressed. This is the story of Exodus. Liberation from Egyptian bondage is a constant motivating refrain throughout the book of Leviticus. It's how God identifies himself. I'm the Lord. I'm the Lord your God. I'm the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, right? It is because God acted that way that Israel must act likewise and be the deliverers of its own oppressed. Um, so, are there any questions about this or comments? Again, we've got this idea of human beings created the image of God, living towards the fulfillment of that image, right? Be ye perfect, move towards that utter spiritual maturity where prayer and justice go hand in hand, and thus reflects the holy name of God. There's also in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 3, an interesting command, let's say, instruction. Really, the word Torah means instruction. We think of it in terms of commandments, which is a really kind of a top-down thing. But imagine instruction as being a process of mentoring, right? I'm going to instruct you how to move towards the, your fulfillment as human beings. There's a connection between Leviticus and Genesis chapter 1. It's quite interesting. So actually, before I do this, I just want to make sure that I'm in the right place in this book, because there are several places that examples of God's holiness can be found in Leviticus. God's holiness is made manifest in this way, and I'm on page 60 here. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. Right? That affirmation, I am the Lord your God, is like a very succinct way of saying everything that just preceded it. This is the story, by the way, that we talked about on Sunday, the story of Ruth. When Ruth and Naomi go back from Moab, and they are orphans as well as widows. They have nobody to protect them. And in the ancient Near East, if you were not associated with some sort of male-dominated family, you were basically as vulnerable as it could be. So Leviticus wanted to make sure that these vulnerable ones were looked out after. So Ruth and Naomi go from Moab in the southeast of Jerusalem, not Jews. They married men who were not Israelites, and they go back to Naomi's kinspeople, and there Naomi and Ruth are allowed to glean the wheat from the fields. So you've got Boaz, who's, let's just look at him as a big corporate farmer. He's a rich man, right? He's got all kinds of grain, but following the Levitical code, he does not reap every last bit of grain, because God commands that for the vulnerable, it must be necessary for them to go in and kind of clean up what can be gleaned. This is distributive justice. Those who have much do not have too much, and those who have little do not have too little. They have enough to get by, right? It's not straight communism where everybody has exactly the same thing, but it is a more socially oriented covenant. Any thoughts about that? Second, you should not defraud your neighbor. This is also in Leviticus. You shall not steal. You shall not keep for yourself the wages of a laborer until morning. You shall not revile the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. all the vulnerable here, right? The workers, those who are beholden to and dependent on others. You shall not do any of that, for I am the Lord. You shall not render an unjust judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, right? Not just, just be partial to the poor. It's both of those. You can't look at the poor any differently than the great when it comes to, being objective. Um, with justice, you shall judge your neighbor. Leviticus 19:13-15. This is what it means to be holy. And here's the one that, we're probably not hearing much of today from the pulpit. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. I can't go any further than this, but to recall a story from my teaching days. When a student tried to tell me that this had nothing to do with a refugee from another country, but if there was an alien that came from outer space, I tried not to laugh. So what you're telling me is that God sees the possibility that aliens should come from outer space and that you should accept them. Well, we know that that's not the case. But those are those teaching situations that you always remember. So, but let me go back. We're talking about refugees, of which Jesus was one shortly after his birth, according to legend. He had to escape, out of the land of Judea where he was, and then into Egypt. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as a citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. And what I just said can be summarized, says God, in this: I am the Lord your God. My name includes all of these things that we just talked about. Look how God concludes in Leviticus with, I am the Lord your God, as if to say, everything that just preceded what I said, that is inherent in my identity and my character. So as Crossan says, my conclusion so far is that for Leviticus 19, the holiness code, divine holiness models human holiness insofar as both maintain distributive justice, especially by delivering the endangered, freeing the oppressed, and protecting the impoverished. So, any thoughts about that?
Dan, I can't help but wonder, how the average Jew at this time, after Babylon, really appreciated and conformed to what we're saying today.
Yeah, yeah. Well, remember, when this is being written, they're still in Babylon, or at best, they are still trying to put together the remnants of the culture that they lost. In 539, Cyrus of Persia gives them permission to go back. And for the next 200 years or so, they are trying to rebuild their lives. But the rebuilding of that life includes what they understand to be covenant regulations that are going to reflect the holiness that is expected of them. And this involves the way we tend to the land. This involves the way we treat our animals. This involves the way that we treat people who are not Jews who come into our land. This involves every aspect of creation itself. Now, as you probably know, we're going to be talking about Sabbath, and there's something a Sabbath known as the year of Jubilee. It's not clear that these things were ever truly practiced. These are the ideals, right? These are not based upon historical circumstances that we can actually go to and prove to have existed. But they are the ideal, right? And as Christians who are inheritors of the covenant, it should be the ideal as well. And so we think to ourselves, this is relevant to us in the United States. When we're dealing with a political situation where the idea of immigration is just right on the front burner. In fact, people say that is the number one issue that concerns them in the upcoming election. But I wonder how many people will be referring to this Levitical code and how they will, logically try to justify current action, right? But a good example of nationalism versus, the moral call of, the faith colliding with each other. And think also of what's happening in Jerusalem or in present day Israel. Though I hesitate to call the Palestinians aliens within the land, at least they are a minority, right? And they are, as God calls, they should be treated as citizens among the Israelites, as among the Jews. Well, that's not happening as well, right? And there's a long, fraught history that goes into this that I prefer not to get into here. But the ideal is one that we must continually come back to again and again and again. Denny, do you want to say more about that?
Just that, I think it's important to remember that Israeli-Palestinian conflict goes clear back to, David and Goliath.
Yeah,
And the Philistines, I didn't realize until I ran across this, that the Greeks, when they exerted their dominance, the Greek term for Philistine, is Palestinian.
yeah,
And it really puts us in perspective that this is a 3,000-year-old, fraught relationship.
yeah. And given that relationship, I can imagine that Jesus himself and other rabbis at the time said, look, at the time it was like 1,000 years we've been doing this. We've been in conflict with each other. And here's the logic. If we are going to say that our God, Yahweh, is a universal God, and this God is the creator God, and this God has a will for all of creation, then we must necessarily include all of creation in the will of God. And it was this logic that Jesus used that opened the door to Gentiles. The love of God, the grace of God is as available to the Gentile as it is to the Jew. This is the theological necessity that attends to a universal God of love. We've been spending 2,000 years trying to learn that one, but it was a new ideal that was at least put in place. It was very easy when God was a God, a tribal God, like, it appears that the God of the Israelites appeared to be a long time ago, 1250 or so. It's very easy to see that God as the model of the warrior who's going to defeat, the other gods of the land. But as soon as that God becomes the only God and every other God becomes an idol standing in the way of our acknowledgement of that God, then we can't help but to take on the role of being, universally disposed to all people, not just to those who are like us. And this was the primary conflict after the Babylonian captivity, because here were the two sides. You had the priestly side and people like Ezra and Nehemiah who came back and helped the people, try to reestablish their identity as Jews. The focus came to be, oh my goodness, you need to follow the law. We need to do things that are going to separate us from the other folks out there. Those other people, they eat shrimp cocktail, but we don't do that because God commands that we do not do it. Those other people out there, they marry among different ethnic groups, but we don't do that. We want to make sure that we stay pure as Jews. Those other people out there, indulge in all kinds of unkosher type of activities, but we want to make sure that we don't do this. We're going to be exclusive. We don't want to have any kind of interaction lest we become defiled and lest we become unholy in God's sight. Well, the other side of the equation was the side that Jesus would eventually argue, and that is, well, just what I've been saying. This universal God is the God of creation, and God has a will not just for a group of people, but for all of creation, and it must eventually include the entire world. And we still have that conflict going on in the Jewish religion today, and frankly in the Christian religion too, if not Islam. And so it really comes back to the God of creation. What was God's intent when creating the world? Because by Babylon, all Jews would affirm that God is the only God, and therefore we must act accordingly. So, thoughts about this? Denny, you pointed out that that conflict with the Palestinians has been going on for 3,000 years. Well, this conflict of exclusivism versus inclusivism has been going on for almost as long as well. And Christians who follow in this tradition, not the literalist fundamentalist tradition, but Christians who follow in this tradition hold to the idea that God so loves the entire world, all of creation, that God is willing to empty himself to such an extent that he will demonstrate his love for creation by doing the very thing that a God cannot do, and that is die. Enter into human existence to such an extent that this God will experience death as well, to demonstrate the power of love, the power of inclusiveness, right? And this is where Crossan eventually comes out. Or we've read Crossan enough to know that this is where he comes, where he lays down the law, so to speak. If there are no other questions or comments, God commands that you keep my Sabbaths in Leviticus 19, verse 3. Now, this is interesting because there's only one Sabbath, right? And that's for Christians, Sunday. For Jews, it's a Saturday. But what does it mean, Sabbath? Well, I'll tip my hand a little bit, but a Sabbath is any experience that humans or non-human creatures have that involves the idea of liberation and spiritual and distributive justice. The idea of rest from the vicissitudes of a world that is always, roiling around us. This is what God's intent is. And there are many ways to be sabbatical, you might say, that are out there. But where does this all begin? If God is the model that we are supposed to emulate, and then we need to know how creation began and what was the role that what was the purpose that God had in creation itself. Which raises the question, okay, well, what is this connection between Leviticus and then all of a sudden we're going over to Genesis chapter 1? The people who wrote Genesis chapter 1 were the Levitical priests. They were the very same priests who wrote Leviticus. You've probably heard me say many times that there are actually two creation accounts in the book of Genesis. The very first one that we read, Genesis 1, verse 1 through Genesis 2, verse 4, was written probably around 539. It was written during the Babylonian captivity. And this is the one that we know, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and so on. The second creation account, if you read them carefully, you will see that the order of creation isn't the same in both of these. The second creation account was written around 950 BCE. So Genesis chapter 2 is called the Yahweh's tradition, was written probably around the time of King Solomon. Eventually, what happened around 400, an editor trying to take all of the traditions of the Jews, put these accounts together in a way that seemed theologically logical, right? He didn't try to write a history. He tried to write a theological treatise that was going to explain who God was and who the people of God are called to be. So Genesis 1 was written during the Babylonian captivity. Genesis 2, this is where Adam is created first out of the dust of the ground. Then all the animals are created. And then, and then there's this garden that's planted, then the animals are created, and then Eve is created. The the order of creation just isn't the same, nor is the focus, the theological focus. Genesis chapter 1 is important for the people writing the Levitical code because it's going to emphasize that very thing that we're talking about. God is a universal God. Our God is the only God there is. In Babylon, where the Babylonians worship the stars, whom they believe to be deities, the moon, the sun, they believe these to be ancient gods. Genesis chapter 1 says, when God creates the heavens and the earth and fashions the sun and the moon or the stars, it's almost as if to say, hey, you Babylonians, those gods that you worship, they're not real. In fact, our God created those things. And you really need to come up to the plate and see reality for what it is, right? So Genesis chapter 1 was really, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and there was 6 days of creation, the seventh day of creation, the Sabbath. This was a liturgy that was spoken in synagogue worship, people gathering and reading the Torah at the time of the Babylonian captivity, as a means of teaching those coming into the system, into the fold, children, about who their God is. Because the threat of assimilation into Babylon was very great unless you continually told your children, write these things on your arms and your heart, bind them to your heart or your arms and write them on your forehead, right? Well, we need to teach our children how to be good Jews, lest they become assimilated. So this was the role that Genesis chapter 1 played. And you know the story. And Crossan does something I think is a little confusing, but I'll just tell you his main point. When you read Genesis chapter 1 and you read the order of creation, you have really 8 little packets of material that are nicely balanced in 2 columns. The first 3 days of creation, and you can refer to this on page 63 of your book. The first 3 days of creation, reflective of a God of order and a God who takes care in building a household, remember that metaphor again, have to do with the separating and preparing. God separates the light from the darkness, the land from the water, and it's like a householder building a house. He's going to frame the first 3 days of creation are framing it in. You put up the walls, you put up the roof and everything. The next 3 days of creation, which is the other half of the creation story, is involved with decorating the house that you've just built and filling it with things that are going to fulfill your purposes. But then finally, and this is an aspect of creation, it's not something distinct from creation. You have the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day is the 7th day of creation, and it is known as the crown of creation. This is everything that God is working towards. When we hear the word rest on Sabbath, hear also a synonym, distributive justice. The rest that is to occur on the Sabbath, according to Crossan, isn't just physical rest, because you work so hard for 6 days, but it is the objective towards which all of creation, through God's creative activity, is moving. Remember, creation just didn't happen once, but it is constantly happening. It's called continuous creation. Through the Spirit of God, we are moving towards an objective, a denouement, a fulfillment of God's will. And so, in some ways, creation becomes a model for salvation history. God revealing God's self in small ways through the Old Testament, and then more and more. And then finally, we get to the coming of the Messiah, Christ, who is the one who brings justice through his incarnation, death, and resurrection. So technically, if we follow that model, we as a church are to be living as Sabbath people. All of our moral insight should be directed towards establishing Sabbath, establishing rest, establishing distributive justice in the created order itself. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. I really like Crossan's point here, because it corrects something that we often hear, and that is that human beings are the crown of creation. And we get this from Psalm 8. How majestic is your name in all the earth, and what are humans that you're mindful of them, and yet you have made them just a little bit lower than the angels and given us dominion over all of the land. We as human beings are not the crown of creation. The Sabbath is the crown of creation. So God's creating act is fulfilled in the Sabbath, in this seventh day that is the reason for the season, so we might say. And Crossan's quote on page 64 really sums it up well. Creation is not the work of 6 days, as is often mistakenly said, and whether it is said literally or metaphorically, historically or parabolically, it is still mistaken. Creation is the work of 7 days, and as its climax, the Sabbath day is built into the very fabric of our world, the very creation of our earth. Sabbath is created right into, it's part of the DNA of our created world. It needs to become fully manifest. Remember Paul's reference, that creation is awaiting the revelation of the children of God. It groans in eager expectation. It is up to us, to take up that calling. That's why, Sabbath is built into the very fabric of our world, and that is why the Sabbaths, plural, are so important for understanding the holiness of God and what it means to make and to keep holy the name of God. When we follow the holiness code, when we seek that which God commands or instructs us to do, we are reflecting the holiness of God. There's something very similar here to a theologian, a Jewish theologian who was very active in the 60s, was very close friends with Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, was, as you can see here, kind of Martin Luther King's right-hand man in the push and the hope for social justice and in the civil rights movement. There was a strong bond that was created by certain aspects of the Jewish community who interpreted God's call in a way very similar to what Crossan is saying, that we must establish Sabbath in the land, in the created world. And so Abraham Joshua Heschel, probably one of the most prolific Jewish authors of the 20th century. Was born in Warsaw, Poland, was able to escape the Nazi takeover of Poland, came to the United States and was a teacher at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he ruffled some feathers because it's a conservative seminary. But he interpreted the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, along these same lines that Crossan is interpreting it. And here's how here's what he says about the Sabbath in his book called The Sabbath. Zion is in ruins. Jerusalem lies in dust. All week, there is only hope of redemption. But when the Sabbath is entering the world, humanity is touched by a moment of actual redemption. As if for a moment the spirit of the Messiah moved over the face of the earth. Well, as a Jew, he was still awaiting the coming of the Messiah. But as Christians, we can say, yes, the Sabbath is the place where the spirit of the Messiah moves over the face of the earth. And it is this toward which we need to direct our thoughts, our prayers, and our actions. That's where I'm going to stop. We are at about page, whatever that was, 64. We only got through about 5 pages. I'm sorry, I just go on way too much. But I am very happy to have been with you today. It's such a nice respite. And hopefully I remembered to record this. I think I did. Damon's always looking for the recording. So I'll see you next week when we'll probably get through the rest of this very chapter, which is chapter 3. And probably pick up in chapter 4 if we're lucky.